On the quiet outskirts of Cedar Hollow, beyond a rusted railroad crossing and a curve in the river road, a small brick hospital once served an entire county. Riverview Community Hospital treated heart attacks, farm accidents, late-stage illnesses, and midnight emergencies that couldn't wait for distant city care. Families rushed through its sliding doors carrying hope and sometimes fear. Over 20 years, thousands passed through its wards. Machines flatlined, doctors fought losing battles, nurses made final phone calls. And yet, according to official state records, not a single patient ever died inside that building. Not once, not in 20 years. Riverview Community Hospital was more than a medical facility in Cedar Hollow. It was the town's safety net. With just over 40 beds and a modest emergency department, it handled everything the countryside could throw at it. Tractor rollovers, winter pneumonia, strokes that struck without warning, and the slow decline of chronic illness. For many residents, the next nearest full-service hospital was over an hour away. Riverview was where babies were delivered, bones were set, and final goodbyes were sometimes expected. That's what makes the records so difficult to accept. From 1983 to 2003, annual health reports filed with the state listed the same number under inpatient mortality: 0. In medicine, even the most advanced institutions cannot avoid loss. But in this small rural hospital, loss appeared to have vanished completely. On paper, Riverview had done what no hospital realistically could: eliminate death entirely. Riverview Community Hospital stood at the edge of Cedar Hollow, where the paved road narrowed into a two-lane stretch lined with sycamore trees. The river ran just behind the property, slow and brown in the summer, swollen and restless in the spring. From a distance, the hospital didn't look remarkable. It was a rectangular brick structure built in stages, first in the 1950s, then expanded in the early 1980s when the town secured a federal rural health grant. The additions never fully blended with the original architecture. One wing carried newer windows framed in aluminum. Another still held older panes that rattled faintly when freight trains passed at night. The parking lot told its own story. Before sunrise, pickup trucks coated in dried mud filled the employee row. By mid-morning, sedans and aging station wagons replaced them. In winter, snow gathered in uneven piles along the curbs, and maintenance workers salted the walkways before dawn to prevent falls. A flagpole near the entrance leaned slightly to the left, as if nudged by decades of wind. Inside, the building felt compact but busy. The front entrance opened into a waiting room with molded plastic chairs arranged in careful rows. A coffee machine hummed beside a rack of outdated magazines. The walls were painted a pale, calming green, chosen, a former administrator once said, to lower blood pressure before a diagnosis ever did. The scent of antiseptic hung permanently in the air, mixed with something metallic that lingered near the emergency department doors. Riverview was licensed for 42 inpatient beds. That number mattered. It placed the hospital squarely within the category of a small rural facility, large enough to provide surgical services, small enough to depend heavily on state funding and federal assistance programs. The additions never fully blended with the original architecture. One wing carried newer windows framed in aluminum. Another still held older panes that rattled faintly when freight trains passed at night. Ambulances from Cedar Hollow Volunteer Rescue arrived regularly. Sirens cut through the quiet town at all hours. Farm accidents were common during harvest season: crushed fingers, fractured ribs, concussions from overturned equipment. Winter brought black ice collisions along Route 17. Summers brought dehydration and heat stroke among elderly residents who refused to install air conditioning. The town's population skewed older. Census data from the 1980s and 1990s shows a significant percentage of residents over 60. Chronic conditions, heart disease, diabetes, respiratory illness were not rare. The hospital pharmacy stocked medications accordingly. Nurses often knew patients by name before charts were pulled. And then there was the maternity wing, small but proud. Local families preferred births close to home. The nursery windows displayed hand-cut paper storks when a baby arrived. Life began at Riverview as often as it ended. At least, that was the unspoken assumption.
Behind the public areas, the building narrowed into staff-only corridors. Fluorescent lights flickered occasionally in older sections. The operating rooms were functional but dated by late 1990s standards. Stainless steel trays gleamed under surgical lamps. Anesthesiologists rotated in from neighboring counties. Surgeons performed routine procedures with steady efficiency. Beneath the main floor, accessible by a stairwell near the supply closet, lay the lower level. Officially, it housed storage, archived files, and a small morgue with 2 refrigeration units. The morgue was rarely discussed publicly, but it existed for the same reason any hospitals did, because medicine does not guarantee survival. Staff members recall nights when the building felt heavier, when a code blue echoed over the intercom and the rhythm of the hospital shifted. CPR compressions behind closed doors, the sharp tone of cardiac monitors, the quiet moment afterward when activity slowed and a physician stepped into a hallway to speak softly with a family. Those moments were not frequent, but neither were they non-existent. In small towns, hospitals become extensions of the community's identity. Riverview was trusted not because it was cutting edge, but because it was present. It stood during floods, blizzards, and power outages. During the severe winter storm of 1993, when highways closed and neighboring counties declared emergencies, Riverview remained operational using backup generators. Nurses slept in empty patient rooms between shifts to ensure continuity of care. Trust accumulates slowly in places like Cedar Hollow. It's built through routine, through annual physicals, minor surgeries, and the familiarity of seeing the same receptionist year after year. It's reinforced when an emergency ends in relief rather than tragedy. Which is why when state records later suggested that no one had died within those walls for 2 decades, the claim seemed almost mythic. Not because the hospital was incompetent, not because it was corrupt in plain sight, but because the building itself, with its aging pipes and limited resources, carried the quiet understanding shared by all medical facilities. That life is fragile, that not every patient leaves, and that somewhere below the hum of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of rubber soles along linoleum, the hospital had always prepared for that inevitability. The physical space of Riverview, its corridors, operating rooms, storage areas, and lower-level chambers, was not designed for perfection. It was designed for reality. And reality rarely records 0.
If the building of Riverview told one story, the paperwork told another. Every licensed hospital in Pennsylvania is required to submit annual reports to the state's Department of Health, documents detailing admissions, procedures, discharges, and in-hospital deaths. These reports are not casual summaries. They shape funding formulas, influence policy decisions, and become part of permanent public health archives. From 1983 through 2003, Riverview Community Hospital submitted 20 consecutive annual reports. Under the column labeled Inpatient Mortality, the number never changed. 0. In isolation, a single year with no deaths might pass unnoticed in a small facility, particularly if most critical patients were transferred. But 2 decades without a single recorded fatality is not merely rare. It defies statistical probability. Hospitals of comparable size in rural Pennsylvania during the same period reported fluctuating annual mortality figures, often between 12 and 25 deaths per year depending on patient volume and seasonal illness. Influenza outbreaks alone typically resulted in at least a handful of in-hospital fatalities in aging populations. Yet Riverview's numbers remained immaculately flat. What made the pattern even more striking was the consistency. There were no corrections filed later, no amended submissions, no explanatory footnotes attached to the data. Audits conducted during the 1990s, routine reviews that flagged irregular billing patterns in some rural facilities, never highlighted Riverview's mortality statistics. On paper, it was a model institution. Internally, however, the documentation was less pristine. Years after the hospital closed, former employees described an internal reporting structure that separated clinical records from state submission summaries. Clinical records, handwritten notes, physician assessments, nursing logs captured the raw reality of patient care,
They recorded deteriorations, cardiac arrests, unsuccessful resuscitations. In those notes, phrases appear that do not align with zero mortality. Time of death confirmed, family notified, body transferred to lower level. Such entries are typical in any functioning hospital. They're procedural, clinical, expected. The discrepancy emerges when those same cases are cross-referenced with state filings. Instead of listing the death as occurring within Riverview's facility, discharge forms often mark the patient as transferred, unstable, or expired en route. The distinction may sound administrative, but it carries legal and statistical weight. If a patient is officially categorized as having died outside the hospital's facility, that death does not count toward the hospital's inpatient mortality rate. Former billing staff recall a gradual shift in how discharge codes were entered into the system. In the late 1980s, federal reimbursement programs began emphasizing outcome metrics. Mortality rates, readmission rates, and complication rates increasingly influenced grant allocations and performance reviews. A hospital reporting higher than average deaths risked deeper scrutiny. One reporting unusually low mortality could highlight that figure in funding justifications. There is no surviving document that explicitly instructs staff to manipulate mortality data. No memo has surfaced bearing such language, but patterns emerge in repetition. Multiple charts from the 1990s contain identical phrasing in circumstances where transfer documentation is incomplete. Ambulance logs in some cases lack corresponding timestamps. Receiving facilities have no record of accepting certain patients listed as transferred. Data gaps appear not as chaotic errors, but as aligned omissions. The most revealing evidence lies in archived mortality review forms recovered from storage boxes after the building's demolition. These internal forms, used for quality assurance meetings, list patient deaths by date and attending physician. They include case summaries and clinical assessments, precisely the type of documentation hospitals use to evaluate care standards. Yet none of those cases appear in the state's official mortality totals. It suggests a bifurcated record system, one set reflecting clinical reality, another reflecting regulatory reporting. Whether this separation was driven by financial pressure, reputation management, or administrative interpretation of reporting rules remains unclear. What is clear is that the numbers submitted externally do not align with the events recorded internally. In public health, data integrity is foundational. Mortality statistics influence statewide healthcare planning, emergency preparedness funding, and resource allocation for aging communities. When numbers are artificially lowered, broader systems may assume lower demand than truly exists. The implications extend beyond one building in Cedar Hollow. Because if a hospital can maintain a zero-death record for 20 years in a community statistically prone to medical emergencies, it raises a larger question. Was Riverview an extraordinary exception, or were the records engineered to appear that way? The answer may never be conclusively proven, but the paper trail, when examined closely, suggests something far less miraculous than advertised. Not the absence of death, but the relocation of it. The Harper family had lived in Cedar Hollow for 3 generations. Their farmhouse sat 10 miles outside town, surrounded by rolling fields and a rusted windmill that hadn't turned in years. Thomas Harper was 68 when the stroke hit, old enough to have retired from full-time farm work, young enough that no one expected the night to unfold the way it did. It happened just after dinner. He was seated at the kitchen table when his fork slipped from his hand. His speech faltered mid-sentence. The right side of his face sagged almost imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably. His wife, Margaret, recognized something was wrong immediately. Their son dialed emergency services, while Margaret tried to keep Thomas conscious. The ambulance from Cedar Hollow Volunteer Rescue arrived within minutes. The siren echoed across the fields as neighbors stepped onto porches to watch it disappear down the road toward Riverview Community Hospital. Inside the emergency department, everything moved quickly. Nurses inserted IV lines, a physician assessed neurological response. Machines began their steady rhythm, beeping, monitoring, measuring. The Harpers were told the stroke was severe but not immediately fatal. Intervention was still possible. For hours, they waited in the molded plastic chairs beneath fluorescent lights. A wall clock ticked loudly in the otherwise hushed corridor. Occasionally, a nurse stepped out to provide brief updates. "He's stable. We're monitoring swelling. The doctor is consulting." Around 2:45 a.m., a physician approached them with a measured expression. Riverview, he explained, lacked the advanced neurosurgical capability necessary if Thomas's condition worsened. A transfer to a larger regional medical center was being arranged as a precaution. The Harpers nodded. It made sense. That was standard procedure in small hospitals. They were told the ambulance would depart shortly. Due to protocol, family members were advised to drive separately and meet him there. At approximately 3 a.m., the ambulance left Riverview's bay. Margaret and her son followed in their truck, headlights cutting through the early morning darkness. The drive to the regional hospital took nearly an hour. They arrived anxious but hopeful, expecting to find Thomas already admitted. Instead, they found confusion. The admissions desk searched the system. No incoming transfer, no patient by that name. They checked again, still nothing. Minutes stretched into an hour. Margaret's hands trembled as staff made phone calls. Finally, Riverview was contacted for clarification. The explanation that followed was brief. Thomas Harper, they were told, had deteriorated rapidly during transport and expired en route. The ambulance had diverted briefly before returning. Paperwork would be processed. Margaret remembers the phrasing more than the words. It felt rehearsed, clean, efficient. In shock, the family accepted it. Grief often arrives before doubt has the strength to form. A death certificate was issued weeks later, listing location as in transit. The matter appeared settled. But questions lingered quietly. The ambulance crew never spoke directly with the family about what happened during transport. No paramedic report was provided to them at the time. The timeline between departure and notification felt blurred. For years, the Harpers carried their loss without public challenge. Cedar Hollow was small. People trusted Riverview. To question the hospital felt almost disloyal. Then came 2008. When demolition crews uncovered sealed file boxes beneath the hospital's east wing, local rumors spread quickly. Among the recovered documents was Thomas Harper's original medical chart. The entry was clinical, precise. Time of death, 3:14 a.m. Location, Riverview Community Hospital. Attending physician's signature present. There was no notation indicating ambulance departure prior to death. No documentation of cardiac arrest during transport. The sequence suggested something starkly different. Thomas Harper had died inside the hospital before any transfer occurred. For Margaret, the discovery reopened grief that had never fully healed. The issue was no longer solely about loss, it was about truth. If Thomas died within Riverview's walls, why was the death classified otherwise? The Harpers were not alone. As news of the recovered records circulated, other families began quietly comparing timelines. Some remembered being told similar explanations: rapid decline, emergency transfer, death before arrival. Not every case contained documentation as clear as Thomas's. Some files were too damaged to confirm details, but patterns began to emerge in conversation. The Harper family never filed a lawsuit. By the time the records surfaced, statutes of limitation had expired. Investigators cited insufficient documentation to pursue charges. What remained was not legal resolution, but emotional reckoning. Margaret once described the hardest part not as Thomas's death, but the uncertainty about where it truly occurred. A hospital room carries a different weight than a highway. The setting shapes memory. It shapes goodbye. For 2 decades, official records claimed no one had died at Riverview. But in one family's archive, a single chart retrieved from a sealed basement, another story was written in ink. and it did not say, "in transit."
In a town like Cedar Hollow, silence doesn't arrive suddenly. It settles gradually, like dust in unused rooms. After Thomas Harper's death certificate listed in transit as the official location, life in Cedar Hollow continued as it always had. The grocery store opened at 7 a.m. Church bells rang on Sunday. Riverview Community Hospital kept its doors open, ambulances still pulling into the emergency bay at all hours. No public statement was made, no correction was issued, no questions were raised at town hall meetings. But within the hospital's walls, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Former nurses later described an unspoken understanding that certain topics were not to be discussed outside designated meetings. Mortality reviews, standard in any hospital, continued internally. Physicians still gathered to examine difficult cases. They still documented causes of death in patient charts. Yet the final classification of those deaths, when transferred into administrative summaries, often changed form. It was not chaos, it was process. Staff members recalled discharge coding sessions where terminology mattered more than narrative. Words like expired, transfer initiated, and stabilized for transport carried statistical consequences. A patient who died in a hospital bed counted toward inpatient mortality. A patient who died minutes later, officially listed as being in transit, did not. In some cases, ambulance paperwork reflected a transfer that was technically initiated, even if the patient's condition deteriorated before departure. In others, the timeline blurred. Documentation focused less on the exact location of death and more on the procedural attempt to transfer care. Those nuances, while administratively defensible in certain interpretations, created a widening gap between clinical reality and statistical reporting. The silence was not only institutional, it was cultural. Cedar Hollow depended on Riverview economically. The hospital employed dozens of residents, nurses, technicians, custodial staff, billing clerks. To question its integrity risked destabilizing one of the town's largest employers. In rural communities, loyalty often outweighs suspicion. Several former employees later admitted they noticed inconsistencies but did not escalate concerns. One nurse described a moment in the mid-1990s when she asked a supervisor why a death she had documented did not appear in the monthly mortality summary. The response, she said, was calm and brief. It was classified differently. No further explanation was offered. Another staff member recalled being reminded that funding reviews were sensitive and that accurate classification of transfers was critical for institutional survival. Survival. The word carried weight. Small hospitals in the 1990s faced mounting financial pressure. Federal reimbursement structures shifted. Insurance payouts tightened. Facilities with declining performance metrics risked losing grants essential to maintaining operations. In that environment, reporting 0 inpatient deaths did more than signal clinical excellence. It projected stability. It suggested control. Over time, the absence of reported mortality became part of Riverview's identity. Local newsletters praised the hospital's exceptional patient outcomes. Fundraising campaigns referenced its remarkable safety record. Community pride reinforced the narrative. And so, the silence deepened, not because no one noticed, but because challenging the narrative felt destabilizing. Even families who privately questioned timelines often stopped short of formal complaints. Grief can exhaust the will to investigate. Legal action requires resources, certainty, and emotional endurance. Most did not have all three. Regulatory oversight, too, remained quiet. State audits typically focused on billing discrepancies or facility compliance standards. Mortality rates that were unusually high triggered scrutiny. Mortality rates that were unusually low did not always raise alarms, especially if supported by documentation indicating frequent transfers. On paper, everything aligned.
Within the building, however, the weight of unspoken knowledge accumulated. Some staff left quietly over the years. Others stayed, convincing themselves the classifications were technically permissible. A few believed the system was flawed, but not criminal, and administrative interpretations stretched to its limits. The most telling aspect of the silence was its normalcy. There were no dramatic confrontations, no leaked memos exposed in real time. Instead, the hospital functioned as it always had, treating patients, delivering babies, performing surgeries, while an invisible boundary separated internal truth from external record. When Riverview closed in 2003 due to budget restructuring, the silence followed it. The building emptied, files were boxed, the community moved forward. But silence is not absence, it is containment. And in Cedar Hollow, what had been contained for 20 years would eventually surface, not through accusation, but through excavation. Because silence can protect a narrative, until someone opens the door beneath it.
By the time demolition crews arrived at the former Riverview Community Hospital site in Cedar Hollow, the building had already been hollowed by time. 5 years had passed since the hospital closed. Windows were boarded. The parking lot was cracked, with weeds pushing through asphalt. Wind moved freely through broken panels along the east wing. Teenagers had slipped inside occasionally, leaving behind spray-painted initials and empty soda cans, but most of the structure remained untouched, sealed in the quiet decay of a place that once mattered. The development company that purchased the property planned to replace the hospital with a small commercial plaza. Before new construction could begin, the old foundation had to be removed. On the 3rd week of demolition, heavy machinery broke through the flooring of the east wing. Beneath it, operators struck something solid that wasn't listed on architectural plans. What emerged was a reinforced section of concrete wall, older than the surrounding structure and sealed from the inside. Workers halted operations and contacted the site supervisor. When the barrier was finally breached, it revealed a narrow storage chamber accessible only through that concealed passage. It wasn't large, just wide enough to hold stacked shelves and boxed files. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of paper and mildew. Dozens of cardboard boxes lined the walls. Each was labeled by year. Inside were patient records. Some were water-damaged at the edges. Others were surprisingly intact, preserved by the dry enclosed space. The contents appeared to be archived medical charts, standard hospital documentation, including physician notes, nursing summaries, lab reports, and discharge forms. At first, the discovery seemed administrative rather than alarming. Hospitals often retain older files for compliance reasons. But as workers sorted through the boxes, a pattern began to emerge. Several folders bore a red stamp in bold letters: Deceased, Internal. The wording was unusual. Hospitals typically mark charts simply as deceased. The added qualifier, internal, suggested distinction. When local authorities were notified, a review of the files began. Investigators compared select records against publicly available state mortality data. Names listed as deceased within the internal charts did not appear in the official inpatient mortality reports for the corresponding years. The discrepancy was not isolated. Case after case reflected similar patterns. Detailed clinical documentation of a patient's death occurring inside Riverview, time recorded, attending physician signature included, yet no corresponding mortality entry in state submissions. In some instances, discharge summaries in the official archive classified the same patients as transferred or expired en route. The internal charts, however, told a more immediate story. Time of death, recorded within hospital walls. Location, patient room, intensive observation unit, emergency bay.
There were no annotations indicating departure prior to death in many of those files. Among the recovered documents was Thomas Harper's chart, its ink slightly faded but legible. The timestamp matched what his family would later see, 3:14 a.m. Location, Riverview Community Hospital. For investigators, the discovery presented both clarity and complication. Clarity because the internal documentation appeared consistent and detailed. Complication because the hospital had been closed for years. Key administrators had relocated or retired. Some former staff were deceased. Legal time limits for certain criminal charges had expired. Furthermore, proving intentional falsification required more than conflicting documents. It required establishing motive, directive, and systematic execution. There were no obvious memos instructing staff to alter mortality data, no recorded meetings outlining a plan. What existed instead was a pattern, repeated over 2 decades, where internal clinical documentation diverged from external reporting. The storage chamber itself raised questions. Why were these files segregated? Why was the space absent from updated building plans? Was it simply an overlooked archive, or was it deliberately concealed? Construction supervisors later stated the chamber's existence predated the 1980s expansion. It may have been part of the original 1950s structure. Whether it was intentionally hidden during later renovations remains unclear. State health officials conducted a limited inquiry. After reviewing a portion of the recovered records, they acknowledged discrepancies but cited evidentiary challenges. Many files were incomplete. Some ambulance logs were missing. Without full chains of documentation, reconstructing each case conclusively proved difficult. In the end, no criminal charges were filed. The official mortality statistics for Riverview Community Hospital remain unchanged in state archives. But in Cedar Hollow, the discovery shifted perception. What had once been whispered became tangible. Boxes of paper had surfaced from beneath concrete, and inside them were names. Names that contradicted 20 years of reported perfection. The hospital building is gone now. The foundation has been leveled. A retail pharmacy stands where the emergency entrance once opened. Yet for those who saw the files or whose loved ones' names appeared within them, the discovery did more than challenge statistics. It exposed a fracture between record and reality.
By the time the boxes were cataloged and the headlines faded, the question in Cedar Hollow was no longer whether discrepancies existed. It was whether they had been deliberate. A cover-up, if one occurred, would not have required dramatic deception. It would have required procedure, quiet, repeatable adjustments inside the administrative bloodstream of the hospital. Healthcare reporting is layered. A physician declares time of death in a chart. A nurse documents final vitals. A unit clerk enters discharge codes into a billing system. An administrator compiles monthly summaries. Finally, annual data is transmitted to the state. At each layer, information is translated, and translation leaves room for interpretation. Former billing staff described discharge coding as both technical and flexible. Certain codes classified a patient as expired, others designated transfer initiated. In rare but legitimate circumstances, if a patient was formally placed into transfer status before death, classification could hinge on how that timeline was interpreted. That nuance, legal, bureaucratic, almost invisible, may have been the fulcrum. If a patient's chart showed death at 3:14 a.m., but a transfer order had been entered at 3:05 a.m., an administrator could argue the death occurred during the transfer process. Such distinctions are not inherently criminal. They become questionable only when applied consistently in one direction. Over 20 years, Riverview reported 0 inpatient deaths. That level of uniformity suggests more than incidental coding decisions. It suggests policy, spoken or unspoken.
Financial pressure provides possible context. During the late 1980s and 1990s, rural hospitals across the United States faced mounting strain. Reimbursement models shifted toward outcome-based evaluation. Mortality statistics influenced both public perception and certain funding determinations. Facilities with worsening outcomes risked deeper audits or reductions in discretionary support. For a small hospital operating on narrow margins, reputation was currency. A zero mortality record could attract grants. It could reassure insurers. It could strengthen negotiations with state agencies. It could keep the doors open. No surviving document confirms that Riverview administrators intentionally falsified data, but the structural incentives were real. Interviews conducted years later with former mid-level managers reveal language that hints at mindset rather than directive. Phrases like protecting the institution and ensuring stability surface repeatedly. In small communities, the hospital's survival was tied to employment, economic continuity, and civic pride. To some, adjusting classifications may have felt less like deception and more like defense. Yet defense implies a threat. What was Riverview defending against? Perhaps scrutiny, perhaps funding instability, perhaps the uncomfortable optics of mortality statistics in a facility already vulnerable to closure. Once a pattern begins, it reinforces itself. If one year passes with zero reported deaths, the next year carries pressure to maintain that standard. A single deviation would raise questions about prior years. Continuity becomes imperative. And so the system, if it was a system, would have required minimal coordination, only shared understanding. A nurse documents reality. An administrator reframes it. The state receives a clean report. No alarms sound because there is no spike, no anomaly, only absence. When investigators recovered the files after demolition, they faced a problem common in white-collar cases: proving intent. Statistical improbability alone does not equal criminality. Discrepancies required demonstration of willful misrepresentation. By 2008, key decision-makers had moved away. Memories blurred. Documentation chains were incomplete. Statutes of limitation restricted prosecutorial options. Even if moral clarity seemed apparent to some, legal clarity remained elusive. The community response fractured quietly. Some residents defended the hospital's legacy, arguing that transfers were common and that data misunderstandings were being exaggerated. Others felt betrayed, not necessarily because deaths occurred, but because of how they may have been recorded. Trust, once questioned, rarely returns to its original form. If Riverview manipulated mortality figures, the cover-up did not rely on shredders or midnight meetings. It relied on paperwork, on the subtle power of classification, on the confidence that numbers rarely invite emotional scrutiny. Because statistics feel objective. They appear immune to narrative. But statistics are only as honest as the hands that compile them. In Cedar Hollow, 20 consecutive years of reported perfection created a myth, a hospital untouched by loss. The basement files disrupted that myth. Whether through calculated policy or cumulative administrative drift, the effect was the same. Death had not been eliminated, it had been relocated, shifted from the column that counted to the column that disappeared. And in that relocation, accountability dissolved into technicality. A cover-up does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers through spreadsheets. And by the time anyone listens closely, the voices that began it are long gone. When people remember Riverview Community Hospital in Cedar Hollow, they don't begin with spreadsheets or state archives. They remember the maternity ward windows decorated with paper storks. They remember the nurse who worked there for 30 years and brought homemade cookies during night shifts. They remember the relief of seeing the emergency room lights still on during snowstorms. Memory is personal. Records are institutional. And when the two collide, the result is rarely clean. If Riverview altered its mortality reporting, the damage cannot be measured solely in statistics. The issue was never that people died. Death is not a scandal in medicine, it is an inevitability. Hospitals exist precisely because life is fragile. Even the most advanced institutions lose patients despite best efforts. Mortality, when transparently documented, becomes part of medical accountability and learning. The fracture occurs when documentation diverges from reality. Public health systems rely on accurate data to allocate funding, identify patterns, and prepare for crises. Mortality statistics influence everything from staffing decisions to regional emergency planning. When numbers are artificially reduced, even subtly, the distortion extends outward. It shapes policy, it shapes perception, it shapes trust. But beyond policy lies something more intimate: closure. For families like the Harpers, the question was never about percentages, it was about place. Where did their loved one take his final breath? In a hospital room surrounded by medical staff, or in the back of an ambulance on a dark highway? The answer carries emotional weight. It determines how memory settles. In small communities, institutions become symbols. Riverview was not just a building, it represented safety. To believe that safety may have been protected through selective reporting feels to some like betrayal. To others it feels like desperation, an attempt to preserve a struggling hospital in a time of tightening budgets. The complexity lies in intention. Was there a deliberate directive to conceal deaths, or did incremental administrative choices made under financial pressure slowly accumulate into systemic misrepresentation? Human systems rarely collapse through a single dramatic act. More often, they erode through normalization, small compromises repeated until they feel routine. The basement chamber with its labeled boxes and red-stamped files became a symbol not only of secrecy, but of compartmentalization. What was known internally remained internal. What was reported externally reflected something else. And yet, the hospital's physical presence is gone now. The brick walls have been replaced by modern storefronts. New employees park where ambulances once idled. Most customers who visit the site today have no idea what once stood there. The official state archive still lists 20 consecutive years of 0 inpatient deaths. That number has not been amended. It remains frozen, clean, unchallenged, improbable. Perhaps that is the most unsettling part. Not that the building fell, not that the files were discovered, but that the public record endures unchanged. History, after all, is often defined by what is written down. In Cedar Hollow, 2 histories now exist side by side. One lives in official documents, a hospital that somehow never lost a patient within its walls. The other lives in recovered charts, in family memory, in quiet conversations that resurface whenever the story is told. Truth does not always arrive with courtroom verdicts or formal apologies. Sometimes it surfaces in fragments, in ink preserved in a forgotten room. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. Riverview's story is not solely about one hospital. It is about the fragile relationship between data and reality, between institutional survival and moral clarity. Because numbers can be adjusted, columns can be reclassified, but loss cannot be erased. It waits, patient and persistent beneath the surface, until someone opens the door. Some histories aren't lost, they're hidden. If this story changed the way you see official records, consider how many other perfect statistics go unquestioned. Because sometimes the most revealing evidence isn't what appears in the report, it's what doesn't.